I recently watched the Nosferatu remake directed by Robert Eggers. The movie's first hour was enjoyable, very well executed gothic horror, as expected of Eggers, but I wasn't particularly enthralled. About an hour in, Eggers introduces a character that I expected to be named Van Helsing. In this version, the character is Albin Eberhard von Franz. He's referred to as von Franz for much of the film. At that point I did this meme. Eggers was now directly invoking the work of C.G. Jung, the famed founder of analytical psychology, eventually even quoting Jung almost verbatim, "I don't believe, I know." But more interesting to me is that von Franz is a clear nod to Jung's star protégé, Marie-Louise von Franz. Von Franz's work is very precious to me. I've mentioned her a lot on this channel, and according to author Matthew Mather, von Franz was the most prominent first-generation Jungian, carrying on a specific thread in Jung's work, writing about a figure of transformation named Mercurius. So a mention of von Franz gave me a clearer idea about what Eggers was up to with this film. Jung's psychological alchemy. You'll find plenty of analysis online, which looks at Nosferatu from a variety of important perspectives, including the analytical psychology angle. But I want to look at this film from the perspective of this channel, and as a humble homage to the work of Marie-Louise von Franz, which I'm so personally grateful for. Now, I want to say up front that modern-day researchers into historic occult, esoteric, and alchemical practices sometimes point out that Jung's findings are out of date, and complain that Jung's work has led to misconceptions that just won't go away. The same can be said about his explorations in various other fields of study. I'm not any sort of expert, but I think there's plenty of truth in that critique. But there are a couple things I'd like to say about that. First, I think Jung's use of religious and alchemical language was for the most part a means to an end. He spent the latter half of his life looking for a vessel which could contain and properly communicate his inner realizations about the process of healing. Jung said that he eventually chose the process of alchemy as his preferred vessel, as it was best suited as the language to communicate inner experiences to others. Secondly, regardless of what one thinks of the validity of the ideas I'm about to discuss, at least as of me posting this, I very much suspect that Eggers is quite explicitly pointing to Jung and von Franz's work, so a look at the film from this perspective might be of value. You see, my hunch is, and I may well be wrong, that all the talk of Eggers wanting to be historically accurate with his depictions of the occult is cool, but is actually missing the forest for the trees. I suspect Eggers is using the language of alchemy and the occult, like Jung, as a very ornate vessel. The message of the film strikes deep at the heart of the status quo. In this video, I'll be revisiting some ideas from my Twin Peaks Redemption of Soul series, so if you've seen that series, some of this will be familiar to you. I will also be easing into some ideas that I was planning to introduce in my next video. To be honest, Eggers' Nosferatu blindsided me, and I put this video together quite unexpectedly. This video essay can hopefully serve as a bridge between the two projects. Eggers invokes Jungian ideas like the shadow, anima, the animus, and the self, and I hopefully won't spend too much time explaining each of those, plus there's already plenty of more qualified and credentialed people that do those sorts of explainers. But please bear with me as I cover some basics, as I understand them, before diving into how I think they relate to Eggers' version of Nosferatu. Here's a high-level table that I found online. You can screenshot if that helps. Throughout her career, von Franz would analyze fairy tales and a patient's dreams, using them as jumping-off points for discussion, and I'd like to make a hobbyist's attempt at something like that. Von Franz and Jung used the language of alchemy in such explorations. He said, quote, "Alchemy represents the projection of a drama, both cosmic and spiritual, in laboratory terms. The opus magnum had two aims, the rescue of the human soul and the salvation of the cosmos." End quote. The way I see it, there are many ways of looking at a story, as many interpretations as people, but in this sort of von Franz style analysis, there are two views, I think. The surface-level plot, and also what is beneath that. In Nosferatu, on the first level, we have the basic plot, a gothic horror dark fantasy. Anyone familiar with the Dracula story knows the plot and the characters. But on the lower level, we have a fairy tale begging for von Franz style analysis. Nosferatu is a powerful mythological cosmic fairy tale in which Ellen and Count Orlok represent two figures in the collective unconscious, and their fate is intertwined with the fate of the world. Nosferatu is, to me, a fairy tale dream. And in Jungian psychology, both fairy tales and dreams are a form of communication from the unconscious mind. And please note that in the unconscious, things aren't ever perfectly straightforward, neat, and logical. There are actually mentions of fairy tales in the film, so I don't think it's much of a stretch to think that Eggers had this in mind. Some parts of the film are a bit more obvious as a fever dream, like Thomas's being trapped in Count Orlok's castle, but a dreamlike atmosphere pervades the whole work. There are many mentions of dreams in the film, including Ellen foreshadowing the ending of the film. I believe we, as the viewers, are the dreamer. Eggers is putting on a dream production for us. Many may disregard this film in the same way they dispose of their dreams each morning. But if you pay closer attention to what the unconscious is saying, there is something of value on offer here. Now, as I discuss the characters in this film, it's helpful to keep in mind something that Marie-Louise von Franz wrote. The unconscious is like a landscape in the moonlight. All its contents are vague and melt into each other, and we can never know for sure where anything begins and ends. As many have pointed out, Orlok is pretty explicitly a Jungian shadow figure. He's literally called a shadow several times. His victims are said to be caught in shadow. The Jungian shadow represents the unwanted, the unseen, parts of ourselves which have been conveniently cut away, hidden in the metaphorical basement or crypt, while we craft an identity for societal gameplay. The individual ego experience and persona, the social mask we present. The word Nosferatu is thought by some to be derived from a Romanian word which translates to insufferable or plague carrier. The shadow is representative of the aspects of ourselves, the characteristics that we find insufferable or unacceptable in ourselves. It could be the sinful traits of a holy person or the holy traits of a criminal. But in this unconscious dream where there are no clear-cut boundaries, Orlok also serves as an animus figure. In the most common understanding of analytical psychology, the animus is considered to be the so-called masculine part of a woman's psyche, an aspect of a woman's psyche that has been devalued and de-emphasized in order to create her ego identity and persona or social mask as a woman. And the anima is considered the so-called feminine part of a man's psyche. In first-generation Jungian explorations of the animus-anima theory, I find that there is plenty of reliance on early 1900s Swiss societal norms and tropes about gender roles and homosexuality. This turns some people off from Jung's work, and this is understandable. As much as I appreciate Jung and von Franz's work, this is indeed one of the aspects that I consider lazy and unhelpful. There's sometimes what I've perceived to be an emphasis on animus possession in women, how it makes a woman argumentative and, quote, too firm in her convictions. I think we actually see Eggers play out this quote within the lengthy scene where Ellen goes through various states of possession. Ellen abruptly and absurdly recriminates Thomas for not writing to her during his imprisonment in Orlok's castle. While yes, of course, views on these topics can be very subjective, I think it's fair to say that some of these tropes are lazy compared to the fascinating research and deeper implications of Jung and von Franz's work. The irony is that first-generation Jungians often explain that the animus-anima shadow theory applies to everyone. Anyone who crafts an ego and a persona suffers the consequences of banishing away parts of themselves. Within Jung's framework, it is just as easily argued that men are in animus states too much of the time, and women in the anima too much of the time. With that caveat out of the way, let's now consider some aspects of Jung's late career writing, certainly more challenging and esoteric. This is where von Franz's intellect and skill set came so in handy to Jung, and frankly to me as a reader. To be honest, I often read von Franz on a topic first, then go back to read Jung's primary text. In these later writings, we find that the anima, animus, and shadow play a deeper, almost mystical role. They're not just personality characteristics. They can be understood as a sort of energy formation called archetypes. And if one can properly recognize and relate to them, these archetypes can serve as intermediaries, pointing us down a path to what Jung called the self. I discuss in more detail within other videos, but quickly the self can be understood as the union of our conscious and unconscious. It is the center and wholeness of who we are. It is a totality, nothing split off. The self is often represented by a god image in myth, fairy tales, and dreams. Esoterically, the self can be understood as an expression of the divine. It is the divine center of one's existence. and both Jung and von Franz would use the term God as a shorthand when explaining the self to some audiences. There is a path to recognizing and realizing the self in one's life, and that path is called individuation. Individuation is becoming fully realized as a human being, not simply creating a social identity, that's the ego or persona. To transform one's reality from the mundane life of the split ego and persona to something divine, that's where the idea of alchemy comes in. Jung and von Franz studied alchemy throughout history, including that of the Islamic sages, ancient Chinese Taoists, and medieval Christian esoteric proto-scientists. It can be argued that the Islamic alchemists, who actually coined the term alchemy, were influenced by Gnostic groups, Egyptian esoteric religious philosophy and practices, and more explicitly, they trace their lineage back to ancient Greek mystic philosophers. The way Jung and von Franz saw it, the goal of alchemy was to turn the mundane, whether it be psychic, spiritual, and/or physical, into something transcendent, the proverbial lead into gold. This is the very mystic philosophy, the alchemical work that Professor Albin von Franz was pursuing in Nosferatu. He is introduced to us as being steeped in the alchemical arts and mystic philosophy as Jung was. He is from Zurich, Jung's home base. When we first meet Albin, he's in a trance-like state working on an alchemical experiment. He is very likely practicing what Jung called active imagination, a practice in which one consciously explores and interacts with the unconscious contents of one's mind, a dreamlike state while still aware, still conscious. Albin von Franz is considered a loon by the establishment, much like Jung, and many of Albin's lines could be straight out of an interview by Marie-Louise von Franz or even academic-turned-esoteric teacher Peter Kingsley in his book about Jung's esotericism called Catafalque. "We've been blinded by the gaseous light of science," Albin von Franz exclaims. "If we are to tame darkness, we must first face that it exists. We must discover evil within ourselves." Jung fashioned himself a scientist and tried his best to keep his esteemed reputation protected from accusations of being a Gnostic crank, so I think he expressed his strongest statements along these lines in more private writings like personal letters. Some of Jung's secrets as an esoteric alchemical practitioner were hidden in his private work, Liber Novus, the Red Book, that went unpublished during his lifetime. It's a large, illustrated manuscript that documents his deep exploration of his own unconscious mind. The Codex of Secrets that Albin von Franz finds in Nosferatu is reminiscent of Jung's Red Book. I think the key to a Marie-Louise von Franz-like alchemical interpretation of Egger's Nosferatu is the secret plan made by Ellen and Albin to stop the plague ravaging the city. You see, only an alchemist, a mystic philosopher, can properly understand the predicament the entire world is in, and the cosmic marriage which Ellen and Count Orlok are fated to perform. Even before the visit by his student Dr. Sievers, Albin was pulled to Visburg by intuition. He was meant to be there. The intuitive mind is intimately related to what traditionally is referred to as the feminine principle, although, as I've said many times on this channel, I prefer the term yin. But because of the subject matter being covered and the depictions in the film, I'll use the term feminine. Once Albin fully understands what needs to be done, he tells Ellen, "In heathen times, you might have been a priestess of Isis. You are our salvation." In that moment, Albin speaks to her from above on high as the father that Ellen needed. Her father had called her sinful and denigrated her. For a brief moment, Ellen has a father figure fully recognizing her value. This works on a more mundane psychological level, but also as her projecting onto him a glimpse of the self, a long-awaited recognition of her potential. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote in her book, The Cat, A Tale of Feminine Redemption, that Isis was represented as the highest divine spirituality, but also as the underworld goddess, ruler of the dead, of ghosts and the night, spooks and evil. Albin understands that Ellen is a being not of their era. Ellen is in one sense a channel to the divine. She's a seer, better suited to ancient times. In another sense, she's a greater cosmic principle. She's a mediator between the world of mankind and the divine forces, between the world of the living and the dead, the bride of death, an incarnation of the feminine principle. Orlok understands this as well, and despite Ellen's protests, he tells Ellen that she is not of humankind. Throughout the ancient world, successful and powerful civilizations had oracular traditions of prophecy. These traditions very likely had origins in even earlier shamanic practices. Peter Kingsley made a name for himself in academia for arguing that many of the founders of the Western rationalistic science-based culture were actually shamanic-like mystics, practitioners of ecstatic knowledge. He argues that the Greek philosopher Parmenides, considered by many to be an early logician who helped found the sciences, was a priest of the god Apollo. In ancient Greece, famously, there were oracles of Apollo, where women channeled the god and spoke on behalf of the god during ecstatic states. The words enthusiasm, mania, and inspiration are related to the Greek concept of possession by the divine, by a god. Apollo is often depicted as a beautiful, youthful sun god. Many scholars consider him to represent ancient Greek high culture as the quintessential Greek god, but in fact, Apollo's origins are darker and more mysterious. There isn't a total consensus about where Apollo came from. Some ancient Greeks said that he came from the north, coming down to Greece for visits, and eventually taking over existing mother goddess shrines, but he'd still disappear up to the mysterious north on occasion. Among many things, it is notable that Apollo was a god of ecstatic trances. Nowadays, we may think of Apollo's oracle priestesses as ethereal figures wisely speaking truth. In reality, the ecstatic possession states they experienced could be intense and frightening. It took others to decipher the meaning of what they said. Now you might ask, what does that have to do with Nosferatu? This might sound like a tangent, but it's relevant to my understanding of Ellen, her power, and relationship to Count Orlok. Ellen's state of possession in this pivotal scene harkens back to those ancient practices. These practices were believed to make an oracle's lifespan short. There's one story I read in a compilation of essays on Apollo that stuck out to me. During the Roman era, when the oracular tradition was waning, an oracle was afraid of getting into the state of possession, and she did her best to put off channeling Apollo as much as possible, even faking an ecstatic state, until she was forced into doing the real thing. It's easier to just view Ellen's possession as obviously the result of a dark curse by a purely evil demon, like in Albin's initial working theory. And it's probably more comforting to deny any prophetic connection to a divine force. And it might be hard for some to accept that a wretched abuser like Count Orlok has any similarities to a pristine god like Apollo. But there are indeed similarities. Apollo was intimately connected with wolves, given the name Lycaeus, meaning wolf-like. We see Orlok has a connection to wolves. Apollo was a god of plague and death. He was believed to use his divine power to bring about disease and death as a form of retribution. The term Nosferatu may be related to a Greek word meaning disease-bearing or disease-bringer. Now, I want to make clear, I'm not saying anyone involved with the creation of Nosferatu or Dracula was consciously or purposefully alluding to certain ancient understandings of the god Apollo. What I am saying is that Nosferatu can be considered as a representation of a particular archetypal energy in the collective unconscious mind, which was once called Apollo by ancient peoples. The way I currently read Eggers' Nosferatu is that Count Orlok is an underworld divine being, living in eternal darkness, awaiting to be called upon. He is a darkened shadow image of the Jungian animus. On one level, a manifestation of Ellen's so-called masculine drive and desires, and on another level, a gateway to the dark powers of God. So we come to the question, how and why would divine powers create such evil? And Ellen indeed asks an important question. Where exactly does evil come from? The divine isn't just sunshine and rainbows. It's also thunderstorms and floods, the very forces of nature the Romanian Solomonar were connected to. Ellen first makes contact with Orlok as a younger woman, a classical maiden. She reaches out to any divine force available, any angel that might connect with her. Angel means messenger of the divine. Ellen does this out of deep loneliness and longing. As Marie-Louise von Franz notes, this condition of loneliness is essential to alchemical transformation. Jung and von Franz both had towers in which they stayed for weeks at a time, isolated from the world, allowing the unconscious to speak to them. But the voice that speaks from the unconscious in this condition of loneliness isn't necessarily a voice from on high. It isn't always a figure of light that descends in peace and harmony. There's a reason why angels are associated with the phrase, "be not afraid." In many traditions, the divine presents itself as a multifaceted, multi-faced, sometimes scary figure. This has been called many names, one of which is Mercurius, a trickster-like divine figure in the unconscious. Mercurius plays the role of quickening alchemical transformation, moving it along, an agent of change. In some encounters, Mercurius's actions leads experiencers to identify him as a devil, like Mephistopheles in Faust. It's interesting that both Thomas and Faust sell their soul, their anima, to a Mercurius figure. But Mercurius is more than a simple evil. As menacing and terrifying as Nosferatu is, it is a darkened image of a supernatural eternal power that plays a complex and dynamic role in this fairy tale. Count Orlok describes himself as having been slumbering in eternity, out of time, until he was called upon by his enchantress. It's certainly disturbing to consider that Orlok, an abuser and torturer on the level 1 plot perspective, can be seen from a deeper mythological and psychological perspective as a change agent that knows her power better than she does. Orlok alludes to Ellen being something special, unique, not human. He says, "You are not for humankind." Ellen is called a sylph by Nock, meaning spirit of the air, term used by the alchemist Paracelsus, someone that Albin has studied deeply. Orlok tells her that she deceives herself. That's to me reminiscent of the role of Mercurius, a catalyst for change. Jung and von Franz considered Christianity in its present form to be limited and losing spiritual power, partly because it hides away the socially unacceptable aspects of the feminine and also the morally questionable forms the divine can take. The way they saw it, mainstream Christianity banishes these aspects of reality to the dark, to the shadow, within the unconscious mind. It focuses way too much on the light and forgets about divine powers down in the depths, in the shadows. We see this in Nosferatu as Christian religious groups work to banish and destroy the creatures manifesting in darkness. We also see that so-called civilized society, represented by Harding and Sievers, don't know of or believe in the power of the underworld, the realm of the unconscious, where divinities play their cosmic roles. Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz argued that Christianity can be renewed and reformed by expanding its view of divinity to include what classically was understood to be the power of the underworld. While there has been worship of a dark mother goddess within some Catholic traditions, like the many Black Madonna idols hidden in plain sight, most of the focus has been on the radiant, transcendent, pure, untouched Virgin Mary image. Anna, a devout Christian, warns her daughters at one point to keep away from filth, but those girls know there is something else brewing. They are greatly disturbed by the monstrosity of the shadow and Ellen's connection to it. Expanding the Trinity into a quaternity allows openly for the powers of the dark feminine and the counterpart darkened brother to Christ to be acknowledged. This allows human beings to better know the divine. In other words, unveiling these hidden parts of the divine and of ourselves allow us to be whole again, to be redeemed from being divided, the original sin. It is possible to become aware of and experience the wholeness of the self, of the true face of God, our true inheritance. Wolfgang Pauli, Nobel Prize-winning quantum physicist and collaborator with Jung and von Franz, said the following: "In my view, only a chthonic, instinctive wisdom can save mankind from the dangers of the atom bomb, which is precisely why the material chthonic, ostracized by Christianity as unspiritual, requires a positive value sign. This manifests itself particularly in the fact that the dark chthonic anima now seems to me superior, and its connection with the light, spiritual side of the Master is a source of hope. So, for me, light and dark no longer coincide with good and evil. Down in the dark depths of the earth, an assumption is required of the woman, not far from the person in heaven." Let's consider Ellen's companion, her cat Greta, which Albin von Franz takes interest in. Ellen tells Albin that Greta has no master or mistress. Albin himself has at least 2 cats in his home. One of the first things that Thomas does in the movie is complain about the cat. In Marie-Louise von Franz's book, The Cat, A Tale of Feminine Redemption, she analyzes a Romanian fairy tale. The princess in the story is turned into a cat, an image that von Franz interprets as a symbol of the feminine, and was an image sacred to Isis worship. I think one valid interpretation is that Ellen's story in Nosferatu is about redemption, a revaluing and appreciation of the feminine principle. And this is done through a Jungian alchemical process. Redemption and salvation occurs when there is a union from a state of separation, which is precisely the redemptive ending of Nosferatu. Ellen represents repressed feminine traits that have been eradicated for centuries by patriarchal powers. Countless women murdered, earthly healers, wise sages, tribal leaders, holders of traditional secrets and ancient ways, subjugated and snuffed out of history. Few these days know of the essential role that women played in sacred ancient rituals, rites, and social stewardship, including in early Christianity. Ellen is a woman in this vein, and for this reason, Albin comes to understand that she's a woman out of place in her time. Von Franz wrote, "There is this absolute split of the feminine image in our civilization. Women cannot be themselves." Ellen standing up to Harding about how she's been treated is not just about these characters, but also speaking to the issue with the patriarchal status quo. This feminine side of worship of the divine is often intrinsically intertwined with a woman's role as life-giver, and eroticism as an expression of divine eros, the unifying power we call love. Professor Karl Ruck writes about ancient Greek female devotees in the cult of an ecstatic god Dionysus. These devotees retreated to an isolated location in nature where they went into a mania, ecstatic states where it is understood that they made love to the male god. And this wasn't just symbolically, but apparently oftentimes a physical act with a partner who was not there. Ellen seems to reenact this exact behavior spontaneously moments after we see Anna shun a kiss from her husband out of politeness. This is one reason why eroticism is a key aspect of Nosferatu. In my view, this shouldn't be reduced to romantic ideals or physical intense lust like we see in Coppola's excellent Dracula film. This isn't eros or desire in the over-intellectualized convolutions of psychological or scientific discussion, but rather this is about the more expansive eros life principle, which was one of the topics that Jung argued with Freud about during their famous break. Jung's view of the libido was more expansive. Life energy is all-encompassing. It is not simply a sexual drive or an aggressive will. Jung explored ideas like Kundalini, Shakti serpent creation energy, found in some forms of Hinduism, and this energy is generally considered intrinsically feminine in nature. Ellen tells Orlok of her experiences, feeling him as a crawling serpent in her body, but Orlok shuts down her projections, telling Ellen, "No, it is your nature." This is the life energy and eros that Nosferatu bloodlust is all about. The blood, of course, being incredibly meaningful to spiritual practices going back into prehistory. Orlok admits he cannot love on his own. Nock, his faithful servant, exclaims at one point, "The blood is the life." This life energy is often intertwined with themes of sexual intercourse, sexual union. This is why Orlok's penetration either resembles or outright involves the sex act. Ellen's convulsions and exclamations often mimic sexual orgasm, and she exclaims in ecstasy. Ellen cranes her head back like these ancient Greek women in divinely inspired ecstatic states. Saint Teresa's agony and ecstasy as she is pierced by the divine also comes to mind. I think the film is telling us that this sort of spiritual energy has been drained out of what we now call civilized society. After Anna shares a bed and an intimate moment of loving appreciation with Ellen, Anne ends up plague-ridden, also convulsing and writhing, reminiscent of orgasm. Later, she is seen in a state of delirium, quite out of character. Ellen serves as a channel for dark feminine energy in a world that is not able to understand it. Ellen feels power in nature and all of creation. This power is not just what comes from heaven, as Anna weakly suggests. Both Ellen and Albin have a connection to this intuitive knowledge. Albin doesn't want Ellen clouded by drugs. He thinks there's more value in allowing her to enter trance states when she is communing with another realm, because Albin understands society's overfocus on the traditionally masculine principle, which I've explained in earlier videos that I prefer to call Yang energy. The rationalistic, logical, calculating mode of living has cut us off from something important. And this isn't some feminist critique against men. One should tell that to anybody who joins feminist movements. When the feminine is liberated, when the cat principle is liberated, it unites in peace and love with the masculine and is not hostile. The fact is that men suffer from this state of affairs too. The status quo imbalance towards the masculine ironically helps foster a crisis of masculinity. This is represented in the film by the well-meaning patriarchal Harding, who has inherited crushing worldly responsibilities from his father and ends up losing everything he loves to the shadow. This is why he dies attempting to make love to his wife's corpse, a disturbing image of man desperately attempting to get whatever life essence he can out of the carcass that is left of the feminine, something so necessary for life now ravaged by the shadow. One could argue he becomes a kind of unintentional vampire, which is what I think many of us become in the status quo, looking for life in a world where life is being drained by the second. Ellen chides Harding, asking, "Why do you hate me and treat me the way you do? You have never liked me. Why can't you hear me?" Here she is speaking on one level to a projection of her controlling father. On the second level, she speaks on behalf of the feminine to a patriarchal society that has lost the plot. Harding is shaken and offended. In his mind, he has taken care of her. He genuinely did what he thought was best. He has no framework for understanding the implications of what he did and what well-intentioned men like him have created. A world drained of soul, the divine feminine. And in such a world, a compensatory shadow will inevitably arise. The divine power some called Apollo doesn't hesitate to bring about plague and pestilence in order to purify what needs to be purified. I interpret Orlok as not only shadow, not only Ellen's animus, but a dark force originating from the self, the divine center of existence. We have banished and rationalized away the feminine powers into darkness, and it has now returned as a dark magic from another time, an older culture which was hidden away in a dark forest. Merlin represented such a magician role in ancient tales, though I think his image has been greatly sanitized. One core takeaway from Jung's work is this: if we persist in believing that the divine is confined solely to safety, love, and comfort, and that these are the only elements we need to recognize, if we continue to struggle to uphold a social mask that's approved by the status quo, we do so at the expense of our own soul and the souls of others. The unconscious will compensate. It will bring balance. You can fear this force as an antichrist devil, pure evil. But this is too simplistic. This figure is what Jung at times referred to as the brother of Christ, an opposing figure from the depths of darkness whose role brings balance to a lopsided world. Its severe, terrifying ways can wake us up to what has been denigrated and lost. It cuts through the BS by dishing out horrifying, phantasmagoric consequences. This brings to mind the dark goddess Kali in some forms of Hinduism, who is said to cut the heads off of egotistical men. Blood drips from her mouth, not too dissimilar from flash images of Ellen throughout Nosferatu. But Kali does this out of love. It's a brutal wake-up call to bring one back to reality. The status quo has taken the divine feminine and subjugated her, and left her lonely. If we want to keep our heads on, this is a dangerous thing to do. As Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, first, there is this period of depression, of emptiness, of nothing going on, and the longer this lasts, the more you can reckon that an enormous amount of energy accumulates in the unconscious. Viewing Eggers' Nosferatu from this angle, one could argue that the greatest threat in the film is posed by those who are typically seen as the heroes. Harding, Dr. Sievers, and even Thomas. Good intentions or not, people like them supercharge repressed divine energy into a monstrous shadow figures like Nosferatu. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, "If we are not conscious of the autonomous life of the archetypes in the psyche, then they are seemingly non-existent, and in fact, even destructive." The Not character is an example of how this process corrodes one's humanity. He was a man of worldly business, striving to achieve immortality through exploitation of others. He has lost his balance, and now only worships the darkness. He calls himself blasphemy at the end of his pathetic story, because he's banished himself from both society and Christ's love. At the beginning of the film, Knock's role is to initiate Thomas into the status quo, offering worldly success. This is a world ruled by the constraints of time. Thomas arrives late and gets flack for it more than once. A good, well-meaning husband, Thomas entered the world of numbers as quantity, and is now also becoming a slave to time and wealth. Ellen says she doesn't want any of the treasures this world offers, but Thomas is locked in regardless. He ends up inadvertently selling out his wife, representing the anima, his very soul, for a bag of gold. And Thomas certainly pays a heavy price. I think it's fair to say that the ending of Eggers' Nosferatu isn't about the vanquishing of evil in battle. Thomas doesn't get the revenge he wanted. This is not an ending where heroes hunt down and kill a monster, the way Harding offered playfully for his daughters early in the film. Instead, the story ends with a reunification of the opposites in a mystical, alchemical ritual. This is a story about the path to individuation, the path to the self, where wholeness and healing occurs. This path involves a play of cosmic archetypes, a tragic love triangle, the psychological complex which has entangled Ellen, Thomas, and Orlok. Thomas is a positive animus figure for Ellen. Meeting Thomas, she finally felt loved and cared for. But because she sees herself as unclean and feels intense socially repressed desires, Ellen wavers. She can't play the role of dutiful wife the same way Anna can for Harding, and Ellen has no social framework for understanding who she is and what she's capable of. It's either be like Anna or get committed in some institution, and thus Ellen's power as an enchantress feeds the shadow. I think Ellen is an active participant in trapping Thomas in Orlok's fever dream castle. An argument can probably be made that this whole debacle is actually some sort of dream logic fantasy creation in Ellen's unconscious. Ellen is upset with Thomas for leaving her, against her wishes, and has him pay the price by encountering the vicious shadow in the form of Orlok. Orlok himself seems to understand that he is a creature of Ellen's desires, and that Ellen and Orlok together feed on and violate Thomas. Although Orlok kills others in the film, Thomas is the only person we see him attacking and sort of humping in a stark, full-body shot. Ellen and Orlok both need Thomas. Ellen telling Thomas that without him she'd be a demon, keeping her from losing herself totally in darkness, the way Nock lost himself. And Orlok in turn uses Thomas to force Ellen into their fated cosmic union of the opposites. But despite all this psychological anima-animus drama, on a deeper level, the individuation process cannot be stopped regardless. Where it encounters blockages, complexes, obstacles, the unconscious transforms however it needs to in order to keep the process going, sometimes transforming into horrifying forces like Orlok's plague, and if so-called unethical, immoral, or evil behavior is required to bring the union of the opposites about, then that's what's going to happen. One can find this sort of dynamic in extreme, offensive, and dangerous occult tantric practices in some traditions. There are the initially disturbing yet enlightening lessons to Moses by his teacher Khidr in Islamic traditions. And even Jesus could be quite shocking in his actions sometimes, turning tables, bringing swords, and destroying that fig tree. Alban von Franz exclaims maniacally, "God is beyond our morals." Our brave heroes want to drive their phallic stakes through Orlok, a metaphor for how the masculine-obsessed status quo has destroyed the heart, the passions of the feminine. But as a mystic, alchemical philosopher, Alban von Franz knows better. Only the redemption of the feminine can redeem us all, can save us from the plague. He says she is the way. Now typically in Christianity, you'd consider Christ to be the way. And Christ certainly represents the transcendent glorious aspects of divinity many of us have heard about in Sunday school. But in dark times, as Dante shows us in the Inferno, we can follow the divine feminine. She can point the way. Recalling Wolfgang Pauli's quote from earlier, she can bring us back to the divine, to the true light of Christ. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, "An attunement to the anima opens up the way into one's own depths. It is as though an inner radio receiver were turned to a particular wavelength. With this, the anima attains the status of a guide to the inner world. Like Beatrice in Dante's life, the anima becomes the guide to the spiritual heights and depths of the soul." Ellen and Alban know that the mystic union must happen. It is hieros gamos, an image of sacred union found in many esoteric traditions around the world, the merging of the sacred feminine and sacred masculine. In this specific pairing, it is the ancient representation of the Queen of the Dead and Lord Death. Alban exclaims, "Her dark bond with the beast shall redeem us all." Redemption. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote about how one can redeem the feminine principle in our times, in our civilization, and quite often it involves conscious passivity in the face of suffering. In other words, a sacrifice. She says there are many situations where one has to do something, but there are other situations where the real deed, the really heroic deed, is to stand the suffering and not do anything. She wrote about discussing this topic with her male patients, quote, "It is very difficult to just passively suffer, simply to endure. One says, I must do something about it. I must break out of this situation. I'll fight." Von Franz would tell her male patients stuck in some situations the following, "Well, you can't do anything. You just have to suffer the conflict, and that's terribly hard. The same goes for women. Quote, if a woman has, for some reason, to redeem her own femininity, then her animus, her masculine side, will say, what can I do? What shall I do? Instead of redeeming the feminine through suffering. Naturally, that also compensates for the mainly Western patriarchal active outlook we have on life. Many people can't stand it. One can argue the radical, revolutionary passivity of Jesus of Nazareth during his arrest, trial, and crucifixion was an example for us all on how to redeem the feminine principle, and through that process transform darkness into light. And right or wrong, agreed or not, it seems pretty clear to me that this is the conclusion that Ellen comes to in Nosferatu, and she follows through on her conviction. She can't fight Orlok the way her positive animus Thomas wants to. How can you kill what's already dead? I think Ellen and Albin realize that the plague is a consequence of how we've treated this world of ours, including how we've treated ourselves, how we've turned something so precious and divine, the gift of life, into a hellscape. In Jung's approach to alchemy, and in many ancient traditions, you're not to banish or destroy evil, but rather to see it clearly, acknowledge it is there, and understand it is an aspect of yourself. Only through that process can a redemption occur, can a true deeper sense of healing and wholeness arise like the dawn. The first stage of Jung's psychological alchemy is Negredo stage, the blackening, the dark shadow. During this stage, individuals often experience feelings of despair, disillusionment, and a sense of being lost, like Ellen does. Literally, the first thing that we experience in Nosferatu is Ellen crying in despair over a pitch-black image. You can't get more Negredo than that. It's a time of psychological putrefaction or decomposition, where old ways of thinking and behaving are broken down to make way for new growth. After becoming infected by the plague, a desperate Anna says that she smells rotting flesh, and she desperately asks Ellen, "What is this darkness?" In Jung's alchemical process, this stage is essential for individuation, to realizing a more integrated whole self. This isn't giving up. This isn't a game for wimps. This is an empowering form of acceptance, and sets the stage for alchemical transformation and wholeness. It's radical. In some Hindu traditions, there is the idea of tapas, the sacred fire of purification. The professor has Thomas and Sievers perform a ritual purification of Harding and Orlok's crypts, in a sequence set on a snowy white evening. They purify with fire. This, I think, is a nod to the albedo, the whitening stage, in alchemy, where one undergoes purification, inner cleansing, and clarity. This sort of purification is key to ancient mystery cult rituals. A sacred purification must take place if the union of the opposites is to occur. Ellen's union with Orlok is reminiscent of a sexual act, and the climax of their union basically looks like a phantasmagoric, synchronized sexual climax. This brings to mind a term sometimes used to describe the brief but transcendent loss of consciousness during an orgasm. The literal translation of this French term is the small death. During the medieval period in Europe, pilgrims often carried badges depicting various symbols, including vulvas, penises, and explicit images of sexual intercourse. Some researchers believe these badges served as protection against the plague. It is theorized by some that they functioned as a patropaic. This is a word familiar to those who studied Jung closely. In an interview with Murray Stein, Peter Kingsley suggests that Jung's use of the word apotropaic is related to Jung's use of the ancient Greek term pharmakon, and the overall concept of, quote, the magic of the poison. This is where a poison also serves as the remedy. This idea of magic of the poison connects back to Apollo, because he was not only a plague bringer, but was also called upon to purify and end plagues. Ellen, copulating with Orlok, is this very magic of the poison, is a patropaic. She's copulating with darkness in order to dispel it. The darkness is both the poison and the medicine she needed. The next couple of points I'll make aren't for the squeamish, but I'll need to mention them for completion's sake. So here we go. Orlok ejects blood at climax, seemingly the very blood he was draining from Ellen. I suspect this can be understood through an esoteric lens. Aristotle considered semen to be a form of purified blood. The word semen is Latin for seed. In ancient perspectives, the feminine nurtures the seed within her, much like the earth nurtures plant seeds, ultimately giving rise to the fruit of her womb. This offspring, capable of bearing seeds and fruit themselves, perpetuates the cycle of life. This cycle is a primordial symbol of the mysteries, a circle of the interplay of the opposites. As humans, we are literally the conjunction of the divine opposites. Jung wrote, "It was clear to the more astute alchemists that the prima materia of the art was man himself. The Ouroboros is a dramatic symbol for the integration and assimilation of the opposite, i.e., of the shadow. This feedback process is at the same time a symbol of immortality, since it is said of the Ouroboros that he slays himself and brings himself to life, fertilizes himself, and gives birth to himself. He symbolizes the one, who proceeds from the clash of opposites. I think this is all connected to the practice of sacred agriculture. Ancient cultures conducted ritualistic practices associated with agriculture. I can't go into this in detail as this could be a lengthy tangent, but traditionally, sacred agriculture is intimately connected with the death and rebirth cycle. The Greek mystery cults like that of Demeter and Persephone, so important to the foundations of our society, were essentially sacred agricultural rituals, and the grapevine, wine, and blood imagery associated with Dionysus and Christ also tie back to sacred agriculture. Earlier, during Ellen's intense sex with Thomas, she begs Thomas to kiss her heart, similar to how Orlok feasts at the end of the film, further cementing the connection between the triangle that is Ellen as anima, with Orlok and Thomas as opposing animus figures. This position is also reminiscent of a child being nursed by his mother, an ancient image used in religious iconography. The goddess Isis was not only the god Osiris's wife, but she also was his mother when he was reborn as Horus, the divine child. A famous depiction of the goddess Isis in antiquity was Isis lactans, Isis breastfeeding Horus. Mother Mary in Christianity was not only impregnated by the Divine Father via the Holy Spirit, but also gives birth to him as Christ. Eggers' film takes place at Christmas time, which seems purposeful, a nod to the idea of giving birth to the divine. Some believe that the image of Mary breastfeeding Christ was inherited from Isis-Horus imagery, and pregnant Anna keeps mentioning that her unborn son is eating of her. Ellen and Orlok's conjunction involves a devouring of flesh. It reminds me of a Marie-Louise von Franz quote regarding ritual death and rebirth. She wrote, "To experience the God who gives you back life by letting himself be eaten by you is the mystery of life." Many see a version of this mystery play out in Christian Eucharist rituals, but most have forgotten the esoteric power of this ritual. This symbolism all speaks to the meta-theme of the conjunction of the opposites, and why it's important for there to be balance, harmony, and for the cyclical nature of reality to continue uninterrupted. Because if you lock into one mode, denying one way of being over the other, choosing to only value the male or only value the female, choosing to cling desperately to the state of life, trying to banish death out of our conscious awareness, then one is up against the alternation cycles of nature and reality. The cycle will persist no matter what, but obstructing it will bring severe repercussions. And now onto the final two images of the film. Von Franz wrote a book at Jung's request about the alchemical text, Aurora Consurgens. Her book served as a companion piece to his alchemical text, Mysterium Conjunctionis. Aurora Consurgens is Latin for rising dawn. In the film's final moments, we see this rising dawn. We see it light up Thomas's face in a tight close-up as he runs home to Ellen. Thomas once again late. This points to the citrinitas, a yellowing stage of the alchemical psychological process where wisdom and understanding begins to dawn. Ellen and Orlok's conjunction, their unification, brings about the golden light of dawn that bathes the alchemist Alban von Franz. This golden light is the gold that the alchemists were after. Early in the film, Alban failed to get the alchemical result he was after, and now it is achieved. He holds in his hand Ellen's cat. As per Marie-Louise von Franz, a cat image used in such a way would be, quote, a total symbol of the self. The cat aspect of the feminine principle is the total real aspect. She really is the potential totality, and in that, greater than anything else. With this image, we know that individuation has been achieved. The final image we see is a full body shot of the deceased Ellen and grotesque, spent Orlok, lying together in a pool of blood on the marriage bed, reminiscent of the German motif called Death and the Maiden. Alban understands the sacred power of this conjunction. He sanctifies it with flowers. This refers back to the flowers that Ellen prophesied about earlier in the film. She said they had been killed by Thomas's abandonment as he strived for achievement within the status quo. As disturbing as this final image is, it is truly an alchemical image of divine wholeness. Marie-Louise von Franz considered nudity to be related to mystery cult rituals regarding rebirth after death, and I believe the only two full frontal nude images we see throughout the film are of Ellen and Orlok. The final bloody image, and Orlok's insatiable quest for life-giving blood in general, speaks to the red stage in psychological alchemy known as the rubedo. He said, quote, "In order to make it come alive, it must have blood. It must have what the alchemists call the rubedo, the redness of life. Only the total experience of being can transform this ideal state of the albedo into a consciousness in which the last trace of blackness is dissolved, in which the devil no longer has an autonomous existence but rejoins the profound unity of the psyche. The opus magnum is finished. The human soul is completely integrated." End quote. The reddening stage signifies the completion of the individuation process, where the individual achieves self-realization and a form of spiritual enlightenment. It represents the unification of opposites, such as conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, and the emergence of the self as a whole, integrated being. I think Orlok was proven correct. They would indeed be one eternally. It's time to bring this video to a close. I think one takeaway from Eggers' film is the notion that the horrifying shadow that is Nosferatu can indeed serve as an angel, a divine messenger. The darkness can be rich soil, providing nourishment for life to renew itself and grow. But this can only happen if the banished aspects of our own very being, our own wretched shadow that reaches out with its long shadowy fingers, manages to get our attention before it is too late. Could it be that the dead are speaking and we're not listening? We should ask ourselves, does our age of superiority, with its rationalist ways, tempt a wake-up call from the depths? Harding's response to all of this is "my reason cannot accept." But it doesn't matter if one's reason can't accept. Reality comes for us all. Harding's perfectly manufactured life of comfort ends up a lifeless plague-ridden ruin. Like I discussed in my video on Magnolia, the persona, the social identity mask, eventually cracks. Harding, an exemplary successful man, cries out, "My God, I'm shattering. I'm breaking apart." It's my view that like the characters in Nosferatu, we face a shadow plague. The whole collective unconscious is in an upheaval. There is disharmony in the conscious behavior of the collective, and that the unconscious is brooding on destruction. That is our situation now. The unconscious toys with the idea of destroying us. Because nobody heeds the collective unconscious, the unconscious is angry. That's the anger of God. I want to close the circle by reiterating that all this mythological symbolism, all this alchemical talk, is not just airy-fairy poetic musing. Jung explicitly said that he specifically chose the language of alchemy as a vessel, as a language, to try and communicate inner experiences. It is a way we can talk about these things that have no place in our current culture. This process, the movement from shadow and despair to redemption of what's been banished into a sense of divine wholeness, isn't just a fairy tale. It's a subjective experience that can be had. For most of human history, there were cultural understandings and actual practices that contained such redemptive experiences, but we have forgotten all about this. We have forgotten the ancient ways. Fortunately, Jung's work opens a door for those of us in search of soul.